All right, everyone. I just want to make 2 points really quick. First, for students that are here for extra credit, just hang on to your extra credit slips until the end of the lecture. We'll be collecting them outside at the same table where you signed them in. Secondly, Professor Clausing has a book that's for sale. That'll be on sale out on the other table up till 7:30, and she can autograph those. So with that said, I want to welcome everybody to tonight's event that's hosted by the Economic Association of Boise State University, and an event that's very generously supported by the IHS, the Institute for Humane Studies. And I'd also like to give a quick thanks to Professor Alan Dalton, who played a very helpful role in organizing this and getting this all together. Really quick with the Economics Association. It's a student-led organization that attempts to bring both students and the community alike, individuals that are scholars and professionals in the field of economics, and that within their field they have insight, wisdom, some knowledge they can pass on through meetings and events like this to those that attend. And we highly encourage that individuals come to attend and kind of gain in that wisdom. So with that said also, my name is Carson Kibble. I'm the president of the association, and it's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Kimberly Clausing of Reed College. Professor Clausing's academic credentials are nothing short of notable and impressive, receiving her BA in economics from Carleton College, where she also graduated magna cum laude, and then shortly after receiving both her MA and her PhD in economics from Harvard University. Over the years, she has increasingly become recognized as a juggernaut scholar and noted national figure in the economics world, especially in areas such as corporate taxation, and has built quite the resume that supports these claims. A two-time recipient of a Fulbright Research Award, recipient of numerous National Science Foundation grants, former economist for the Council of Economic Advisors, researcher for the International Monetary Fund, the Hamilton Project, the Brookings Institution, and the Tax Policy Center, having testified before both the House Ways and Means Committee as well as the Senate Committee on Finance. All of these are just a small list and example of her accomplishments. Today she is here to get into her work outlined in her latest book, Open: The Progressive Case for Free Trade, Immigration, and Global Capital. Please join me in welcoming Professor Clausing. Thank you.
I'm just checking this is on, right? Okay, great. Thank you, Carsons, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Alan, for the invitation, and thanks to the whole community for showing up tonight. I'm hesitant to remind you that you're missing Jerry Seinfeld in an hour, but if some of you leave at 7, I won't be hurt. So they told me to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll go to questions, and my experience has been that people have lots of questions in this area, so I'm happy to answer them. And as Carson mentioned, I'd be delighted to stay and sign books at the end, too. So today I'm going to talk about our current moment in economic history and why that moment has been difficult for many U.S. workers. And then I'm going to turn to sort of the policy challenge of this moment. And to give you the punchline first, what I'm going to argue is that the ideal policy response to this difficult economic time is an embrace of trade and immigration, while at the same time pursuing stronger domestic policies to redistribute income through the tax system, through a more progressive tax system, and have a stronger social safety net. So that's the basic argument. You might notice that that's roughly the opposite of what we've been doing for the past couple of years, and that is something that I will comment on as we go too. So first, let's talk about what's going on in the United States economy as of late. So if you look at this graph, you see a strong performance of GDP per capita in the blue line, and that's showing you that our economy has really actually done quite well over the past 35, 40 years. But if you look at the red dotted line, that's telling you how the typical household is doing, the household that's kind of right smack in the middle of the income distribution. And one thing you'll notice is that red dotted line isn't going up with this sort of strength and vigor with which you see the blue line rising. And so what we've seen accompanying that sort of divergence is increased income inequality, and that's shown up as different levels of income growth for those at the top of the distribution as those in the bottom. So if you look at these two clumps of bar charts, one thing to notice right away is that the income inequality hasn't been with us forever. If you look at the 35 years after World War II, the economic growth of those in the bottom 90% of the population, the pace at which their incomes were growing was actually faster than that of those at the top, right? So it's not an inevitable capitalist feature that we see increasing income inequality. Some people talk like that's endemic to capitalism, and it need not be so, right? We had quite a stretch, in fact, where a rising tide lifted all boats. But what we see in the most recent 35 or 40 years is a divergence from that pattern, where the typical incomes of those in the bottom half of the population have been nearly stagnant. Those in the sort of the 50th to 90th percentile are growing, but they're not growing as fast as they were used to in prior generations. And the incomes at the top are really taking off. The top 10% are doing really well. The top 1% are doing exceptionally well. The top 1/10 of 1% are really doing well, right? And so one big question that we should all ask is, why has that happened, and what does that imply about economic policy? And so let's first start with what's going on that can explain these trends. So one hypothesis, if we look at those two eras, is to say, okay, well, what's different about these two eras? In the first era, there was less trade, there was less immigration. So that's one possibility, is that trade and immigration are rising, and that's caused a more competitive environment for U.S. workers. And that probably is a contributing factor. So I'll get to those two considerations in more detail in a minute. But there are lots of other things that have changed too, right? So if you go back to 1980, which I realize many of you are too young to do, but some of us can remember 1980. If you go back to that time, the technology and the role of computers and the amount of mechanization in our factories, all of those things were very different than they are now, right? So if you wanted to order something, you did it by opening a Sears catalog, and you would place a call with a phone that was tethered to the wall. These days, things look rather different, right? Computers have changed our economy in a lot of different ways. They've also changed our work environment in a lot of different ways, and they've shifted demand away from some workers and toward other workers. And in particular, they've shifted demand towards the likes of you, people in this room who will have college educations, and away from those who are less well educated, whose work is now more likely to be displaced by computers and mechanization. So technological change has been a big force in our economy. Other things have been happening too that are different in these two periods. We see a much bigger role of market power now than we did 35 years ago. If you look at concentration of sales or profits in different industries, we'll see that it's much more concentrated now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And so that's another really big, important change. The labor markets themselves have changed in important ways. Unionization rates have gone down. The markets in general, labor markets, are more competitive, and they more richly reward those at the very top with the most skills. We've seen changes in social norms and power and bargaining across groups, and it's just one piece of evidence for that. If you look at CEO pay, you see that now the typical CEO earns 300 times what the median worker in their company earns, whereas if you go back to 1980, it was 30 times. Right, so one hypothesis is that CEOs are now 10 times better relative to their typical workers than they were in 1980. That's possible. But what I think is probably more likely is that our social norms of how we pay those at the very top have changed, right? And that's something that we see, varying quite a bit across countries, is the appropriate amount to pay those at the top, which is a social matter. And also we've seen important changes in policy, changes in tax policy, changes in regulations and the like, right? So if you've been paying attention, there's at least 6 big different things that have happened, and there's probably more. We could probably make a list of 10 or 15 things that have happened that make those two periods different. You'll notice that some of those things are related to each other. For instance, if you're competing in the world economy, you might be more likely to adopt technological change. Or if you can sell your services to the world, right, you might be able to command a higher premium for them, right? So they're interconnected explanations, but nonetheless, there's a lot going on. And the basic message so far is that that workers in the middle of the distribution do have reason for concern. The economic growth hasn't trickled down to them in the way that they were expecting to based on prior generations, right? And we'd really like our economy to deliver this sort of inclusive growth that benefits most workers, and I think that's a reasonable thing to ask from the economy. But it's not entirely clear what per se is the culprit here or what the ideal policy response is. So what we're going to do next is talk about trade and talk about immigration and look at the role that those have played in this story and what the policy response might be there, and then turn to other policy responses that we could take to tackle this sort of income inequality. So international trade comes with a lot of benefits, and I describe those in chapters 3 and 5 of the book, which I encourage you to all take a look at. There's a lot of really wonderful things about international trade, and you'll notice that whenever you buy anything as a consumer, like a lot of the things that you go out and purchase, some of those are made abroad, and they're less expensive because of competition from abroad, so that's nice. But trade also provides the opportunity for us to specialize in what we're good in and trade that with other countries. And most people would rather, see their kids grow up to work on airplane production or Hollywood movies than to necessarily grow up sewing shirts or something, right? So we might take a moment to sort of recognize the sort of wonder of comparative advantage. If you specialize in what you're good in and trade, you can have more of everything. But what I'm going to focus on instead, because of our topic today, is the downside of trade. And there are really noticeable and important downsides. And one group of researchers, David Otter and some of his colleagues out of MIT and some other institutions, have been working on, in particular, the downside of trade with China. And in a series of research papers that they've looked at, they found some real costs associated with trade with China in terms of both wage growth and employment outcomes for workers. And what they do in their research for those budding social scientists out there is they take advantage of this geographic variation that you see in that map between different regions of the United States and how exposed they are to competition with Chinese imports. And it turns out China's making particular things, right? And if your town has a factory that competes directly with China, right, then you're more exposed to that shock. But if you're in, say, Nevada, it doesn't look like China's taking over the casino market just yet. Right? So you might be more insulated from that shock. So they use that variation to sort of get at what's going on here, and they find that the China shock probably resulted in US job loss of about 1 to 2 million manufacturing jobs. And that's over the period where China was entering the WTO, which is in the sort of the first decade of this century, is the one that they're most focusing on. Now, I would point out that sounds bad, and I agree that losing your job is super painful, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. But there's also some other things to think about with respect to this China shock. So for one thing, it's possible that those Chinese imports also created some jobs elsewhere in the economy. So for instance, some US companies might have used imported Chinese steel, been more productive as a consequence, more able to compete on the world economy, make cars that are more competitive, for instance. But even if you set those positive effects aside, another thing to keep in mind is that those job losses totaled 1 to 2 million, over a period of a decade. But we live in an economy that creates and destroys jobs at a much, much larger rate than that. So the typical quarter in the United States economy, right, we destroy and create over 6 million jobs every single quarter in this economy. So this is a very creative, destructive place, right? And that is part of capitalism, right? Some jobs get lost, other jobs get created. You can lose your job because a robot takes it. You can lose your job because Walmart moved to town and you used to work in the smaller drugstore. You can lose your job because people don't like the product that you used to make and they decide to buy something else instead. There are lots of reasons that you can lose your job. But there's also a lot of new jobs that show up from time to time, right? And if you look at the blue lines here, those are the job gains. The red lines are the job losses. You'll notice the recession, you can see quite nicely there. The Great Recession shows up in the data as a period where job loss was much bigger than job gains. But that's due to sort of the financial collapse of the U.S. financial system. it wasn't doing well at that particular time. That's a subject for another one of these beautiful lectures. But what to note now is that 1 to 2 million job loss associated with the Chinese import shock is serious, right? But this isn't something that's completely new. Like, we have a lot of churn in our economy all the time. We've also seen a steady, nearly monotonic decline in the share of manufacturing jobs in the US economy from 1950 to present, right? So if you look at that decline, right, you'll notice that we used to have over 30% of our workers in manufacturing. Now it's less than 10. But the decline has been really steady and downward that in total time. You don't really see the China shock in this diagram, right? I mean, you could say, well, maybe it's responsible for some of that, but there's a lot of the other years to talk about there too, right? So what is causing that? Well, one thing that we see in almost every country is they get richer, the manufacturing sector shrinks relative to other sectors, and that happens throughout the world. It's happening in a lot of middle-income countries now. Even countries like Turkey and Mexico see that as they get richer. That's partly just the natural structural transition. But some of this is also technological change. If you look at manufacturing output for the United States, it doesn't look like this. It looks much more steady, and in some years increasing even. Right? So we're actually kind of making a lot of manufactured goods, just like we used to. But we're making them in a way that uses less and less labor. So how do we do that? Well, it's not magic, it's technology, right? If you go and you look, for instance, in a US shoe factory, and believe it or not, we have a shoe factory, at least one. In New England, there's a New Balance factory. And if you go into this New Balance factory, there is so much machinery in that factory, right? It's just chock full of machinery. And there's some workers, but it's mostly machines. If you go and you look in a foreign shoe factory, it doesn't look like that, right? It tends to involve a lot more workers and fewer machines, right? But in countries where labor gets expensive, because they're rich countries, right, the temptation is to make things in ways that use less labor. And so that shifts demand away from some workers and towards others. So the question is then, what do we do about this churn, this job loss, the potential costs from trade? And some have said that, okay, well, you told us that lots of things were causing this middle class struggle, right? Trade is one of them, right? And maybe we can't do anything about the march of the robots, and social norms are hard to change. But what we could do is we could put up tariffs, and that would turn back trade, right? And maybe that is a useful thing to do for US workers, because while we can't tackle some of these other things very easily, we could very easily, actually, it turns out we've done this lately, we can increase trade barriers and reduce how much we trade. So should we do that? Right? And so that's the question I'm asking in part in this book, and my answer to that question is no. And my answer to that question is no, not because I fetishize the gains from trade, because I've been an economist for 30 years, although that's true. I have been an economist for 30 years, and I do think trade is kind of wonderful. But my answer to that is that I think actually that restricting trade is more likely to harm those exact same workers that we were trying to help, right? And there are several reasons why I think this is true. First, it turns out that it's very hard to undo the China shock, or any shock, really, but it is really pretty easy to create a new shock, right? So, for instance, we've done this lately. We put a bunch of tariffs on our trading partners, and actually, I anticipated this. I wrote this book actually before all these tariffs increased, because candidate Trump told us all the tariffs were going to increase, and it turns out he was true to his word. All the tariffs went up, and that created a lot of shocks for U.S. workers. For instance, a lot of our trading partners retaliated by putting tariffs on U.S. products, right? And so, for instance, U.S. agricultural exports have fallen substantially, as not just China, but the European Union, Canada, and other countries have retaliated against U.S. agriculture. In the Chinese case, we see our exports to China have declined by over $10 billion because of their tariffs on U.S. agricultural products. This has had real cost to farmers in the Midwest and elsewhere. If you look at foreclosure rates and debt levels in the agricultural community, they're higher now than they have been at any point since the wake of the Great Recession. Income growth to the extent that it exists at all in agriculture, is because of government subsidies that have been handed out at taxpayer expense to offset the shocks that have been caused by these tariffs, right? So that's the farming sector. General Motors has paid $1 billion in tariffs in the most recent year. This is a same year where that's the equivalent of sort of having their entire workforce on strike for several weeks, right? Because we saw that the strike cost them more than $1 billion, but that lasted longer than that. So at the same time that they're paying all these extra tariffs and paying more for their inputted intermediate goods, their inputs that are coming from abroad, the import part of their inputs, they have been closing factories in the Midwest, right? And in part because it's more competitive, more cost effective to produce elsewhere. And lots of other companies have announced lower profits, layoffs, and uncertainty surrounding this trade war. So while we haven't been able to sort of return to the industries of yore, we have been able to create new levels of uncertainty and disruption in U.S. labor markets. So that's one reason why I think protectionism can be costly. But a second reason is to remember that what tariffs really fundamentally are is a tax, right? They're a tax, but not only are they a tax, they're a consumption tax. Right? They're falling on your consumption. And not only are they a consumption tax, but they're a regressive consumption tax. Because when you look at who buys disproportionately more imports, they're more likely to be poor. So the share of the income spent by the bottom decile on tariffed goods is 3 times the share of income spent by the top decile on tariffed goods. And that's because, and that's in share terms, right? And that's because, one, the poor consume all of their income and the rich have the luxury of saving some of it, which is nice. But 2, the poor disproportionately consume imported products. So you could sort of imagine, for instance, the kinds of things that you find when you shop at Walmart versus at the local farmer's market, right? And who shops in those 2 places. You do see that the import bundles, or the consumption bundles tend to be more import intensive for the poor. So if you look back at U.S. history, actually, if you go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, we used to fund the government with tariffs, right? We paid for the things that the government did with tariffs. And one of the reasons that we stopped doing that is people thought it wasn't fair to the poor. The poor always had to pay the tariffs. And the rich that weren't consuming all of their income or were buying a lot of domestic things, right, were more insulated from that. And so that's part of the reason they moved towards the income tax in the early 20th century, was to share the burden of government more evenly, right? So I think it's naive to think that putting up a bunch of tariffs is going to help U.S. workers, because it's going to hurt their purchasing power as consumers, and it's going to introduce new shocks. A final thing that it hurts that's a little more indirect is our international relations, right? When we stop being friends with countries that we used to be friends with, or when we create conflicts with countries like Canada or the European Union or China, right, we make it more difficult to get together to solve really vexing international problems, things like climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, tax competition, right? And we need those kind of friendships to solve those problems, and I think trade conflicts tend to sow mistrust and make it more difficult, right? I also think it's important to keep in mind that trade has had a lot of benefits, not just to the United States, but to the rest of the world. Actually, I think the most encouraging thing that I'm going to say tonight is right here. If you look at what's happened in that same period, right, that we just talked about since 1980, to the global poverty rate, which is the share of people that are living below $1.90 a day, which is the World Bank poverty line. It's declined dramatically. So those blue squares are showing you for the world, it used to be 40% of the world's population lived below $1.90 a day. Now it's closer to 10%. If you look at those red circles, that shows you the Chinese fall from nearly 90% of the population below that World Bank poverty line to almost none today, right? I'm not saying trade is the only thing that caused that, but openness to the world economy certainly helped poor countries become richer over this last generation or two. So we've seen enormous progress, not just in China, but in India, in Vietnam, and in a lot of other countries too, smaller countries throughout the world, right? And openness to the world economy has been an important part of that. And it hasn't just shown up in GDP growth is shown up as poverty reduction, as improvements in literacy, as improvements in life expectancy, as in reductions in child mortality. So that's a very encouraging trend, and one that I would be sort of loath to shut down by creating new conflicts. Okay. Another important thing to keep in mind, right, before we say, okay, well, it's great that they're doing well, but the U.S. economy isn't. Remember, the U.S. economy, if we go back and look at this picture, is actually doing fine. That GDP per capita line is growing dramatically. What we have isn't so much that our economy is suffering while other economies are growing. Our economy is growing too. It's doing really well. And in fact, if we shared our GDP equally, we could have, up to now $20,000 per person extra now relative to 40 years ago, if you sort of added up all of those years. But we do have a distributional problem. We are not necessarily sharing those gains in GDP evenly, and that is a greater problem and something to sort of think about. But one thing to keep in mind, though, is that the gains in those poor countries are not demonstrably at our expense. Another thing to keep in mind is that trade agreements themselves aren't the same as trade, right? So let's say, okay, trade is responsible for some of U.S. worker woes, but restricting trade isn't necessarily going to help. Is it possible that we could design trade agreements that would better help U.S. workers? And I guess my answer to that is maybe, but a lot of what might be upsetting to us about trade has nothing to do with trade agreements. For instance, we don't have a trade agreement with China, like NAFTA or something like that with them, right? And there's very little evidence that NAFTA caused the harm that we've seen in these past diagrams. If you look at very thorough analysis of NAFTA, there's almost no evidence that it harmed American workers. But if we really wanted to prevent, say the China shock, it's not clear that writing better trade agreements would have done that. Like, we had already offered China the same treatment we give other countries through the WTO, and should we have levied tariffs on this poor country to try to prevent them from becoming richer? It does seem like sort of an odd thing to suggest, right? So one thing that I would encourage us to do is maybe distinguish even this trade explanation from the trade agreement explanation, right? It's not clear that writing better trade agreements would even change the sort of what disruption we've seen due to trade. Okay, so that's basically all I'm going to say about trade. I do think it is responsible for some disruption, and I'm certainly would agree with that. It's not that it didn't generate negative consequences, it's that it also comes with a lot of positive things. And then if your answer to this disruption is to restrict trade, my concern is that you're actually going to sort of harm the very people you're trying to help. And in particular, it will distract us from sort of more efficient ways to help those people. And I'll talk about those sort of towards the end of this lecture, of how we might more usefully direct benefits towards workers. But what I'd like to talk about next is immigration. And it turns out the immigration story is even more cheerful and uplifting and easy, I guess, than the trade story, because it doesn't come with the negative consequences. So trade has a lot of good things, but it does come with some negative consequences. With immigration, it's really hard to find the negative consequences in the data. If you look, there's been hundreds and hundreds of studies of immigration, and the picture is pretty clear. Immigrants are good for the United States economy. They're good for almost every group in the country. Even the groups that we think may be harmed by immigration are relatively small, and that literature is pretty contentious, so we're not even sure that they're necessarily harmed. It's quite evident that immigration is good for the immigrants themselves, and there are just very few losers in this story. So if you look at trends in immigration, it's now the case that immigrants are about a little over 13% of the population. This counts anyone residing in the United States that's born abroad. The undocumented immigrants are less than a quarter of that, and that population is actually falling at present, as is, in fact, legal immigration, too. By the way, most of the undocumented tend to come into the United States and overstay their visas rather than go across the border, just as a point of fact. Now, it turns out immigrants are far from evenly spread out If you look at this map, it shows you sort of the immigrant density throughout the country. It looks like there aren't that many in Idaho, but the ones that there are probably here, it looks like, judging by that circle. But if you look across states, in Oregon, where I hail from, it's 9.6% immigrants. In California, it's 27% immigrants. In Montana, it's 2%, right? So it varies quite a bit. Interestingly, if you look at polling data, and I've got a similar map in the book that I didn't make a slide of, but if you look at the polling data, immigrants are most popular where they're found and least popular where they're not found. So the states that are highly skeptical of immigrants among the native population in polling data are those states that have almost no immigrants, which is, I think, itself kind of an interesting fact. Now, some feel that we have too much immigration despite the lack of evidence, and I think there's just really very little evidence that immigration is harmful. Under the present U.S. administration, the wall is just one part of the anti-immigrant strategy. There's also increased vetting and other obstacles for legal immigrants. There's reduced refugee quotas, and there's a rhetoric that I think is definitely comes across as less welcoming. And we've seen, therefore, drops in legal immigration in the United States and drops in the number of foreign students who want to study at our universities. And those are both, I would argue, quite damaging. This trend isn't unique to the United States. If you look in other countries, there are other countries that have also seen immigrant backlashes. For instance, the United Kingdom, restricting migration was part of the impetus for leaving the European Union, which they are looking to do shortly. So, this isn't a US-only phenomenon, and I would say the same is true for actually the trade backlash too, that we've seen other countries also be embracing sort of more nationalistic economic policies. I would argue that the dangers of restricting immigration are also quite prominent and also likely to harm US workers, and there are four big ones that I would sort of focus on of what we lose when we restrict immigration. The first thing we lose talent and innovation. If you look over the past 40 years, about 60%, actually a little bit over 60% of all Nobel Prizes in scientific fields, so that's all the sciences, and economics gets to count, I'm happy to say, in the scientific fields. But if you look at that tally, over 60% of all those Nobels were won by American resident researchers, which is kind of amazing, like go US, right? On the other hand, one thing to keep in mind is of that Nobel laureate population, a majority of them, a scant majority, but a majority, over 50% of them were won by foreign-born researchers working at US institutions. In other words, by immigrants, right? The very same people we count in those statistics. So, I don't think that's a coincidence, right? When we get immigrants from abroad, they're often bringing extraordinary talent, right? And that talent is reaped in the universities and in the corporations that they work in. Over half of our graduate students in the United States in computer science and engineering are foreign students. This is an area where we have massive skill shortages and where lots of them would like to stay, but often they have to win sort of visa lotteries to stay, or they're forced to return to their home countries. So that's one big thing that we lose. We lose that sort of talent and innovation in those industries if we clamp down on immigration. We also lose entrepreneurs and job creators. And this is an important point because it gets to the reason why it is that we don't necessarily see immigrants depressing wages. If you look at companies, 40% of all Fortune 500 companies were founded by either an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. If you look at our billion-dollar startups, half of them have an immigrant on their founding team. Immigrants also disproportionately found small businesses, restaurants, salons, you name it, the little businesses as well, right? But this gets to the point about why they're not necessarily depressing wages. When you think about taking in labor or immigrants, you think, we're taking in labor supply. That's going to increase the supply of workers. And if you know any supply and demand diagram, right, when supply increases, the price falls, right? So that should depress wages. But because immigrants are also disproportionately entrepreneurial, they're also creating demand for labor too, right? So they're increasing job creation throughout the economy. And that's why we don't see them depressing wages. A third thing we lose when we lose immigrants is that we lose important parts of the labor force, not just those skilled immigrants in science and engineering, but also people who do jobs where there are also shortages, but that have less skill. So examples would include agricultural labor and elder care, right? These are both areas where we have disproportionate sort of immigrant labor forces, and that's helpful to those sectors of the US economy. And importantly, immigrants also really help alleviate budget pressures. So let's compare the United States to Japan. In Japan, there are 8 retired people for every 10 workers, right? So for every 10 people we have working in Japan, there are 8 who are retired, right? In the United States and Canada, that number is 3, right? In Italy, it's 5, right? But even at 3, right, if you pay any attention to the budget, we complain a lot about things like Social Security and Medicare and all this money that the old people are costing us, right? And I can say this because I'm not going to be old for a few more years. But, you know, that is a much easier fiscal burden when there are 3 retirees for every 10 workers than it would be if there were 8. Right? And you might ask, well, why do we have 3 and why does Japan have 8 and why does Italy have 5? And the reason that we have this healthier 3 is partly because immigration, right, is increasing labor supply right now, but also because recent generations of immigrants have higher fertility rates. And that's really helpful if we want to keep all the promises that we made to provide health care and Social Security to those valued elderly citizens, right? So this is an important demographic issue as well. So by now, I've probably convinced you that immigrants are awesome, and therefore we should just have more of them rather than less of them. But you might stop and say, well, why is there this backlash then if immigrants are so good for the economy? And I think there are sort of 3 sources of that. So I'd also like to talk a little bit about those. One is this concern that they'll depress wages, right? And as I pointed out, there are theoretical reasons to be skeptical of this argument because, on the one hand, they increase labor supply, but they also increase labor demand. You might think we could use variation like this to figure out whether they're actually depressing wages, but this is difficult too, because we might say, okay, well, it looks like there are lots of immigrants in California. There aren't that many in Montana. Let's just look at wage growth, right? And we'd find, well, it's higher in California than Montana, and that's true, actually. But that doesn't tell you that the immigrants are either depressing or not depressing the wages, because immigrants are naturally going to go where there are jobs, right? So it's not enough to just look at that correlation and conclude something from it, because if you're a smart immigrant, you're not going to go to the place where there are fewer jobs, right? So we've got a little bit of what we economists call like an endogeneity problem. Like it's hard to see like what's causing what. But occasionally there will come along a really nice natural experiment. So one was provided courtesy of the Cuban government in 1980, where they briefly decided, because Cuba was a pretty restrictive place at the time, and they decided briefly to allow Cubans to leave, right? And so there was this brief moment where Cubans could leave, which was a great opportunity for those Cubans. Over 120,000 of them went to Miami, right? Like overnight, really in a very short amount of time. This increased the labor force at the low-skilled end of the population by 20%, right? And it was an opportunity not just for the Cubans, but for economists, right, who were like, hey, natural experiment. Now we can see what happens when you just sort of sprinkle immigrants in one community, without any really good reason for it. And what was found in that experiment was that there was very little change in the prior path of wage growth or employment of the native-born people of Miami, right? So their wages were not depressed, and they did not lose jobs. And the finding was since contested by a different researcher who was like, oh, but it looks like actually it did hurt this one group of Miami folk, but it turns out there was also a quirk in the data because the census had oversampled them, and when you got rid of that quirk, you also got rid of that finding. And so that ship has sailed, so to speak. It really does look like the Mariel Boat Lift, which is the name of that event, had no adverse labor market effects. And the argument is because, of course, when the Cubans came to Miami, they didn't just increase labor supply, but they also founded businesses and did increase demand for products in the local economy and things like that. A second concern with immigrants is that they might harm state and local budgets, particularly in places where they're found and really concentrated. So you might think in New York or Los Angeles or Houston or Miami, right, that it could put a lot of stress on state and local budgets. And that is true. Like if you look at the typical low-skilled migrant in their first generation, they will cost a net about $1,500 relative to what they're paying in taxes of extra sort of spending. Their children, by the way, are a net fiscal boon, even though low-skilled immigrants' children actually pay more in taxes than they're using up in government services, right? So in an intergenerational way, migrants are actually helpful, right? And I think that's one reason why you see, states like California doing just fine budget-wise these days, right? They're weirdly running a surplus right now. So that's in part because, you do get these short-term hits, but they come with sort of longer-term benefits. And a third concern, I think, with immigrants is cultural concerns, right? There's concern that they will be different from native-born Americans, that they will in some way weaken institutions or commit crimes or do things like that, right? And I would just point out on all of those concerns that the data do not support them, right? There are not higher crime rates among immigrants. In fact, there's lower crime rates among immigrants than there are among the native-born population. If you look at their effects on institutions in places where immigrants are thicker on the ground, you actually see stronger metrics of institutional strength, not weaker ones. And you actually see the native populations performing better in school, for instance, as immigrant shares are higher, right? So I think the data tell a very different story than some of the anti-immigrant rhetoric. So in the end, I suggest more, not less, immigration for the United States economy. And finally, I would notice that there's an important moral argument for being open to refugees as well. Anyone who has heard of the Emma Lazarus poem at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, might note that it talks about being welcoming to the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And those are real people. We have a lot to offer them. They have a lot to offer us. They often become enthusiastic Americans. Any of you who've used sriracha sauce on any of your fine, see, sriracha sauce is awesome, right? Sriracha sauce was founded by a refugee who came to the United States who named the company, Hui Fong Foods, after the boat that took him to the United States, and has refused to make that sriracha sauce anywhere else because he wants to make it in the country that he feels he owes a debt to because it was the only one that would take him when he was a refugee. So to recap, the argument here is that American workers have a real problem, but trade barriers and border walls are more likely to harm than help. So what should we do instead? So that's what I'm going to focus on in the end here. The last section of the book outlines several sort of common sense solutions that can loosely be grouped into three categories: supporting workers directly, true tax reform, and what I call a better partnership with the business community. And there isn't time to go into every detail, but let me point out a common theme with some of these policy suggestions, which is that it's important to go to the source of a policy problem when you have a policy problem, right? So in the case of worker wage growth, right, we have tools actually that can affect that directly, right? So rather than starting a trade war and hoping that the workers will somehow emerge victorious despite all the disruption and uncertainty and consumption taxation that entails, right? Why not just go help the workers directly if that's the problem? And then you don't actually need to worry about what's causing those frightening graphs that I showed you at the beginning. Whether it's technology or whether it's trade or whether it's some third set of things, social norms, what have you. If you're going straight to the workers with your policies and trying to address their well-being directly, right, then you're going to help them regardless of what harmed them in the first place, right? So I think that's a really important principle to keep in mind whenever you have an economic problem, whether it's climate change or inequality, is that try to go as directly to that problem as possible. I was actually kind of dismayed. There was a trade question on the Democratic debate the other night, which I was watching, and they all started talking about climate change, and I was like, well, kind of related, but it's not clear to me, like when something crosses a border that creates necessarily carbon at that moment, right? Like, I mean, so we could argue like GDP itself creates carbon, but even that's pretty indirect, like, because not every GDP creates carbon. Like if I pay someone $100 to listen to my problems, that doesn't create carbon, emissions. But if I burn coal, $100 of coal, that creates carbon emissions, right? So if we have that problem, we should go straight to the problem, right? Which involves making carbon more expensive, which is a very simple thing to do. You put on a big carbon tax, right? Problem solved, right? And you also should probably fund some of the green solutions too. But the argument in the book is that we can help workers directly. We can change the tax system to do that, and we can also accompany that with some other helpful policies. So let's talk about how to help workers directly. This might be things like the earned income tax credit, which actually creates negative tax rates at the bottom of the income distribution. We can expand that and make that more generous so that it reaches more people and it reaches higher up the distribution. That would be a really helpful tool. We can provide wage insurance so that when people lose a high-paying job and have to settle for a lower-paying job, the government makes up some of the difference. That's been tried in very small contexts, but we can make it much bigger. I think free community college is long overdue. Some states have experimented with that, and that's been very successful. We can make public investments in places that have been left behind and hit by concentrated job loss. Pittsburgh, for instance, did a great job sort of investing in infrastructure and education and sort of revitalizing that city to be less about the old economy and more about the new, moving towards technologically sophisticated industries instead of steel. We can, of course, use our trade agreements more strategically to pursue important social aims that require international cooperation, rather than just using them to sort of pursue narrow sets of interests. I do think we have a lot of important international problems like climate change and tax competition, where if we work together in trade agreements, we can use sort of the carrot of the market access that comes with trade agreements to also solve some of these bigger problems. But one really important part of this puzzle, I think, is, in fact, the tax system. And I spent a lot of time studying the tax system, and globalization itself creates some challenges for the tax system. Like, how do we challenge mobile capital income if it can move across borders, right? And that's one of the areas that my research is really focused on a lot. And I think there's a lot we can do to modernize our tax system to make it more compatible with the global economy and with the sort of economic situation we've had. So I would sort of build tax reform around 3 pillars. One, making sure everybody gains from changes in the economy that raise GDP. So when GDP goes up, the typical worker should do better, right? And we can do that by expanding negative tax rates at the bottom, by lowering tax rates in the middle, but also by raising tax rates at the top to pay for the government goods and services that we need. I don't think the increase of tax rates at the top has to be as extreme as some people have suggested. There are lots of ways that we can actually get a lot more revenue from those in the top quintile, say, without resorting to exorbitant rates, by closing loopholes and by treating different types of income more similarly, right? So right now we have a big preference for capital income relative to labor income. We can treat those more evenly. We have a big preference for foreign income relative to domestic income. For multinational corporations, we can treat those more evenly. And I think you can get a lot of revenue just by sort of evening out some of these different tax rates, because when the tax rates differ and you're a rich person with accountants and lawyers, right, you just put the income into the more tax-preferred form, whereas if you sort of make the rate similar for those, and I mean different types of income for similarly rich people, but that make sort of the same rate across those types of income, then you can collect more revenue without sort of relying on really high tax rates. So I think we need a more progressive tax system. And I would also include a carbon tax as a key part of the tax system. I realize that the carbon tax can be designed in a way that is burdensome to the poor and the middle class, but can also be designed in another way, which is helpful to the poor and middle class. So imagine, for instance, you just take in carbon tax, you put the social price of carbon in there, let's say it's $50 per metric ton. You collect all that tax revenue, and then you dividend it out back to the American people on an even per capita basis, right? So we collect based on your carbon footprint, then we hand it back to you based on the total collections divided by the number of people. It turns out if you simulate that, about the bottom 70% of the people actually end up with more money after this than they would before it, right? But every person would find that consuming carbon is more expensive. So every time you take a flight, for instance, that plane ticket is going to be more expensive. And every time you buy gasoline, that gasoline is going to be more expensive. And when you heat your house, that's going to be more expensive. So people will change the temperature they keep their house, and they'll change how often they go to, relatives' weddings far across the country and stuff like that. They will change that in response, but they won't be poor, right? Because they'll get this money back in the form of that carbon dividend. And I think that's a very elegant solution to a whole host of problems, right? You're helping with the distribution by sort of disproportionately getting money back to those at the bottom, but you're also really helping with this really essential problem of climate change. So let me conclude with just a few more thoughts, just one more thought, really. I wrote this book in part as a reaction to the 2016 election. And the outcome of that election, I think, really reflected a lot of different factors. But one theme that has really been sort of consistent in both the run-up to that election and in the aftermath has been this prominent promise that President Trump has made the American people to put America first, right? So this America first theme has been appealed to many times in the years since to rationalize tariffs, trade wars, immigration barriers. And I'm sad to say that the United States is not alone in embracing this sort of economic nationalism. This has been evident in Brexit. This has been evident in many other countries in Poland, Hungary, Brazil, Russia, China, elsewhere. This rising tide of nationalism, I would say, is dangerous. If you go back to the last big era of globalization, it ended with a rising nationalism, 2 world wars, and a Great Depression. And I'm not saying ours will end that way, and I hope it doesn't. But at present, the economic discontent that has come from inequality and relatively slow wage growth have created a situation where that kind of nationalist rhetoric is much more appealing than it should be. And I think that's dangerous not just to peace, which is an important objective all by itself, but it's also dangerous to the prosperity of workers, both here in the United States, but also abroad. But most important, I think, when we wrap ourselves in the flag and we blame foreigners for our troubles, we're distracting ourselves from much easier solutions to the problems that we see all around us. And so I would encourage you to sort of think about those problems and come up with more direct solutions. And if you're interested, I'd be happy to engage with you in conversations about the book. Okay, so this moment in history is a really important time to get economic policy right. I hope that we will do a lot better than we have been, and I look forward to our conversation and answering any questions you might have.
All right. So I got a question for you. As like a young person, do you think rather than trying to close these tax loopholes like passive income tax and trying to put a wealth tax onto people who make, like $30 million bucks a year just on their like passive income, do you think it'd be smarter to try to influence young entrepreneurs to just have a want to actually just close this income gap that exists rather than trying to force new taxes on people and try to encourage them to use what we have, like this passive income tax, which is really, really cool, and actually just pay their workers better? Do you think it'd be worthwhile to try to actually do that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different approaches that we can use to sort of tackle this problem. I think the tax system has an important role to play. I think philanthropy has a role to play. I would be hesitant to rely entirely on philanthropy because while some philanthropists, such as Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, have done terrific, amazing things with their fortunes, the vast majority of people who have enormous fortunes don't, right? So then the question is, do we want to have basically what's implicitly a tax on kindness when we sort of rely on the nice billionaires to give away their fortunes? I do think we can do things to sort of pressure, rich people, CEOs, everybody to sort of think about their actions in the larger social context. And then one of the things that I talk about in terms of the better partnership with the business community is more transparency, right? So it doesn't have to be a tax. You could just actually require companies to provide information to people. And I imagine sort of a sunshine labor report and a sunshine tax report. And all you'd have to do is just say what you're doing. Like, we're not necessarily changing the law at this point. We're just saying, tell us what you're doing. So in the case of General Electric, they'd say, okay, well, we earn this much profit. These are the countries where we reported it. These are the countries where we made tax payments, and they just show that information. And similarly, they'd be like, this is what our CEO makes. This is what our median worker makes. This is the share of our jobs that are offshore. And in those factories, they earn these things, right? And if everybody were required to have that information dispersed in a uniform way, as opposed to relying on the press to sort of like sensationalize little incidents, right? I think in a way it would put some sort of moral pressure on people to be good corporate citizens, right? Because they would have to defend these documents, right? And all of us as consumers and as potential employees and as potential investors would have that information. And going all the way back to Adam Smith to present, right? The one thing that we've realized about markets is they work best when they have information, right? And so I think it would be silly for corporations to be against this when we all know that information is good for markets because it tells us things that are really useful. So I think that would be an excellent step in the right direction.
Thanks for coming. I first heard of you on Econ Talk, the podcast, a couple weeks ago, and then was delighted to find out that you were going to be speaking here. So thanks for coming. This question is a little off topic. It doesn't have anything to do with trade or immigration, but you did bring up taxes. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on the wealth tax, and particularly on Gabriel Zuckman and I think it was Emmanuel Say's, or however you say his last name's, arguments for the wealth tax.
Yeah, so I think the wealth tax is a really good conversation for us to be having, and I think highly of both Zuckman and Sayers and their work in this area. If it were up to me, if you just made me like queen of tax and I got to do what I wanted, I would be hesitant to choose a wealth tax because I think there are better ways to achieve the same objective. So if you think about it, let's say you have $100 of wealth, right? And let's say I'm going to tax it at 2%, right? Then that implies that, okay, I've got $100. Every year the taxman comes along and takes $2, right? But your $100 is probably invested in something, right? So maybe it's sitting there in a stock, and that stock generates a capital gain, right? So another way to tax it is to tax the income on the investment. If you tax the income on the investment instead of taxing the base, right, then in a way you're taxing more the riskier things and less the safe things, right? And so the government is becoming sort of a risk partner in risk taking, and you're also taxing more the things that are sort of excess profits and rents relative to like government securities or things like that. So in a way they're equivalent, but they're also, I think there's some nicer properties associated with taxing the income on the wealth rather than the wealth. I do think that capital income should be taxed more. But if it were up to me, I would tax the income on it rather than the stock. But you can achieve with graduated rates the really same objective. A final consideration that I think is important in today's climate in particular is the constitutionality issue, right? So we know that we can tax income. Like, we have been doing it for a long time. I would hate to see our one shot at taxing, so let's say things line up and we get to actually tax the rich a little bit, right? I would hate to see our one shot at that come down to the judgment of just John Roberts. And I mean, John Roberts is a fine guy and everything, but I don't think like the swing decider on the Supreme Court should get to decide this. And so I would stick to taxes that we are 100% sure are constitutional.
Thanks again for coming. My argument is, and your early slides tend to pan this out, is that this redistribution of wealth has been going on since 1980. The nationalist economists, the right economists have done a very, very good job of instilling this fear and mistrust in the American people. Do you think there's any validity to the argument, and I don't hear this argument being made, that what we want is a reset? We want this redistribution of wealth that's been going on since 1980, only the distribution has been going up and not broad-based. Is there any validity, and we've done a horrible job of countering this rhetoric?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that policy has contributed to the increasing income inequality, and that we should reverse some of those policy changes. And that means, I think, strengthening the ability of workers to negotiate in context. And I think it means asking companies to deal with issues of market power. And I think it means redistribution through the tax system. And, I think one way to achieve that is to have graduated rates that keep on graduating, right? So if you're a billionaire, you can pay a higher rate than if you're a millionaire, who can pay a higher rate than if you're just a 500,000-aire or whatever. And that can be done, I think, just as well through the income tax system. I mean, one of the difficulties with wealth is we tend to wait till it's realized to tax it. So one way to reform that is to pursue something that's called mark-to-market taxation, where you get an annual tax bill that's based on how much your assets have increased in value. So we don't have to wait for you to sell the stock to tax you on it, right? And that's something that Senator Wyden has proposed, studying at least through a proposal that the Senate Committee on Finance is considering. Many of the political campaigns have talked about moving in that direction as well, and I think that can be very promising. There's some tricky things there associated with liquidity and losses, but they're surmountable. There are ways to, you can allow people to, let's say your stock lost value, instead of having the government issue checks to Warren Buffett that year, right? You would just let him carry forward those losses to offset future gains, right? And with respect to liquidity, you could let people settle up later with an interest charge, right, for the time that they weren't, so let's say you want to hold on to your business and you don't want to sell it to pay this mark-to-market tax, that's fine. But when you do sell it, you'll have to pay the tax at that point with an interest charge.
Hi, Dr. Clausing. I had a question about, so the two, your earned income tax credit idea as to create a wage floor versus the $15 an hour minimum wage. Which do you think would do a better job at helping minority communities generate wealth, not just income?
Yeah, I actually think both would be a really nice thing, and I hate to answer your question without the either or, but if you think about it, one difficulty associated with the earned income tax credit is you might worry that, if we made it much broader and much more generous, that maybe the low-income employers would capture some of that themselves because they'd just be able to pay people less, right? So I think we need to support that by also raising the minimum wage floor. I don't think we're anywhere near the level where it would create harmful employment effects, but there is a level that does exist where it would, right? So you can't just be like, okay, the new minimum wage is $45 and call it a day, right? You've got to pick a reasonable amount. Oregon has done something which I think is actually quite clever, which is it's got a tiered system depending on whether it's a rural area, a small city, or Portland, right? And I think we could do that nationally, where cities have $15, small cities have $13, and rural has 11, say. And then index it for inflation. And that indexing part is important because what we've seen is this ridiculous ricochet where every time we raise it, its real value declines in value, and then it raises, and then its real value declines, because of inflation. So I think indexing it would be nice. We could even put in a commission, to study whether it's, creating any adverse employment effects, and if we end up in some sort of like Great Depression type situation, we could revisit it, and have an automatic mechanism for doing that. But in general, I think we could sustain easily a higher minimum wage without the adverse unemployment effects. And then the earned income tax credit does even more to sort of turbocharge and get people above the bare minimum.
Hi, thank you for being here. On your first slide you had with the GDP growth versus the household income growth, there was a period of about 7 years in the Clinton administration where it looks like they are keeping pace.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could talk through what you would attribute that to, and also what you would attribute the divergence to.
Yeah, so I have to say that I think those Clinton years get a bad rap among young people, because if you look at my lifetime, and I'm, going to be 50 this coming summer. That was the time period of my whole lifetime that had the fastest wage growth, it had the biggest reduction in poverty, the best macro economy in terms of aggregate statistics, and we were at peace. There was an intervention or two here and there, Kosovo and whatnot, but it was a pretty good decade. So I'm not sure why people are vilifying that period that much. So what happened? There was a good macro economy. There were very good monetary policy and fiscal policy choices. The budget actually went from deficit to surplus over that decade. Yes, the U.S. government had a surplus. 1 year, I had to rewrite all my econ notes to be like, actually, it is possible to have a government surplus, because we did this year. It's crazy. So there was 1 year where we did that. So we had really good fiscal policy, really good monetary policy. I think there was some nice external effects, like we no longer had to worry about the Cold War because that ended. So that freed up some money that we would have spent on the military to do other things with. So it was a really good decade, in part because of luck, but in part because of policy. And I do think there were some deliberate budget choices. The earned income tax credit was expanded at the beginning of that decade. We actually raised taxes slightly on the rich at the beginning of that. The beginning of the Clinton years. There were some tax cuts for the rich later in the Clinton years too. But, I think it was a pretty good policy decade and a pretty lucky decade too. Some of this is just, avoiding bad things.
Hello, thank you so much for answering our questions. Mine is, do you think that friendlier trade relations between China and the U.S. could lead to cooperation on issues relating to the climate? For example, do you think the U.S. implementing sort of a carbon tax would be a model that's possible in China?
Yeah, I think absolutely. One thing to keep in mind with China is the counterfactual is a really difficult thing to establish, right? There's clearly some things that we don't like, right? Like I think the handling of the Uyghur population by imprisoning people who are religious minorities is a prime example. Some of the suppression in Hong Kong is another example, right? But then the question is, so if you get angry at a country and you throw sort of a temper tantrum and you start a trade war with them, does that help any of those things, right? And I think the evidence is pretty clear that that doesn't help those things, that engagement and interdependence, while they don't solve every problem, they don't make them worse typically. And I'm a big believer in the power of engagement and of working with allies in areas where we do disagree, right? So if you find that maybe intellectual property is an issue, if you're working in a pleasant way with the European Union and Canada and Japan, you can all collectively, assert soft power to try to solve that problem, right? And I would point out that China has actually made a lot of progress in intellectual property protection that is underappreciated. But I do think that the sort of foreign policy and economic policy by tweet and tantrum has not been helpful to any international objective.
Hi, Dr. Clausing. So as I understand it, the growth of earnings in the top decile of the United States in terms of households has largely been because of capital appreciation. And would it not be a fair solution to sort of mandate that firms provide their workers with stock options, or if we were to mandate savings accounts, for example, as a way to sort of redistribute capital?
Yeah, I really like the idea of having mechanisms that would encourage people to save and encourage companies to encourage people to save. There's some simple things you can do, like opting in your employees into savings plans. And then we can also look at ways to encourage companies through the tax code or otherwise to sort of match those savings. Well, one thing I do worry about a little bit in the employee stock ownership arena is that you're already working for a company, right? So you got your job, right? And they control that. If they're giving you your wealth as shares of their stock, and then something goes wrong with that company, right? Then you're sort of doubly misfortunate, because you not only have lost your job, but that stock that you used to think was worth a lot is now not, your savings are gone too, right? So as much as I like the idea of getting more even share ownership, I would much rather see employees own, mutual funds, shares of stocks in lots of different companies than just their own company, because of the risk issue, which I think is a real one, because there are a lot of companies that, were really successful 30 years ago that don't exist right now.
Hey, so I'm actually a declared economics major, and I was curious because it seems obvious to me that if the tax system becomes more progressive, that rich people just put their money in like tax-exempt securities. So I was wondering about, as economists, how do we go about simplifying the tax system and getting rid of these exemptions when, there are lobbyists, and like my dad's an accountant and he doesn't really want the tax system to be simplified, or,
Yes, the accounting industrial complex. Yeah, it's a real thing. There are a lot of people who would lose jobs if we simplified the tax system, yet we must find the political will to do so, because I do think this loophole issue is a really, really important one. And I also think we need to adequately fund the IRS. And Larry Summers has a paper suggesting that we could get $1 trillion over 10 years with just increasing IRS funding and allocating it better, right? And that's a lot of money that we could get just by enforcing our current tax laws. But also making our tax laws more even, I think, is just the way to go. Like, I would much rather live in an economy where all the rich people were expected to actually pay, whatever we decide, 40% of their income in taxes across levels of government, than where some of them were paying 20 and some of them were paying 60 because some people put in this really high 60 rate, but then the smart ones or the crafty ones got accountants and then helped themselves to this lower rate. And that kind of thing is more incentivized as we get to higher and higher tax rates. So if we did try this sort of, 70% style tax rates that some people talk about, I think we would see an explosion of creativity in terms of how to avoid that tax. Whereas if we just sort of stuck to a more reasonable tax and then actually collected it and publicly enforced it and shamed those who avoided it, I think that would be the better approach. Let people keep a majority of what they earn, but then when they pay their taxes, make them actually pay it.
I have a question, going back to transparency. We have a medical industrial complex that is an aberration in that it's 4 times more expensive than any other Western country. And efforts to consolidate insurance companies, pharmaceuticals, hospitals has not resulted in cost savings. So, and the problem is there is no transparency.
Yes.
What mechanisms could we use to improve transparency in the medical system?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Unfortunately, it's a little outside my expertise, but I do think there's been some work suggesting, and I think even there's some proposals now requiring more transparency in billing. But one of the difficulties associated with the whole medical sector is you don't tend to do it's not like going to the store and you buy an apple and it's like, oh, that was $1, so next time I'm going to buy a different apple. And instead, it's not like you go get heart surgery and you're like, ooh, that was more than I thought. So in the next heart surgery, I'm going to go to this hospital. It's like it tends to be that people get these procedures at times where they don't have, even if they had all the transparency in the world, they wouldn't necessarily be able to use that as effectively as we would like. So I think transparency is part of the answer, but I also think we need a more rational healthcare system. It's a mess, and my preferred solution is sort of a Medicare for all we want it kind of solution, where people would have a public option to elect into, and then where the government would participate in sort of bargaining against hospitals and pharmaceutical companies and the like on behalf of the American people. And then if people want to have their own private insurance on top of that, that's great, or from their employer, that's fine. But but there would be some sort of reasonable option that helps keep prices down with hospital prices, which are a big part of the high prices we pay, but we also pay a lot to insurance companies to bicker about the prices. So,
Doctor, over here. First, I want to say thank you for taking time out of your day to come out here and talk to us. My question is on taxes as well. I was curious on what you thought on what a flat tax would do, and what you thought benefits, pros, cons kind of thing.
Yeah, so I prefer a progressive tax structure where we start actually with a negative rate, then we go to 0, and then we go up to the flat tax that every person would pay. And the reason why is because, in fact, there are all sorts of different things that hit people in the economy, and there's different amounts of luck that different people have. I mean, the role of luck in the economy is actually something that is underappreciated. Like was brought up in a way to think that, like, if you just work hard, like, everything will be great, and you just, and that people get what they deserve, and there's sort of a just desserts sort of behind a lot of our economic outcomes. But the more you sort of look at the world around you, the more you realize how lucky you are if you're lucky, and how fragile it all is if you're not lucky. Like if your child has an illness, right, and you can't afford to pay for it, and then you end up medically bankrupt or what have you. And so I think the tax system should be sensitive to how much people have. I don't think you would get a lot of extra efficiency benefits from just one rate. If you look at what makes our tax code complicated, it's not the rate structure. That's pretty simple. Like the simplest part of doing your taxes is looking up the tax table at the end. When you figure out what your taxable income is, you just find a line, you're like, okay, that's how much. It's all these loop-de-loops and amusement park rides that we take to figure out what our taxable income is, because there's all the credits and deductions for this or that or the other thing. And I think so where I'd start with the tax system is doing less social policy through the tax system, in the sense of not picking out this, that, and the other thing that we're going to give credits or deductions for, but still having the rate itself be highly progressive. I mean, if I were queen, which no one has offered me that position yet, so.
Hi.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you think, like, as we start to become kind of a mechanized, like, labor force, and Democratic, like, presidential candidates, or like Andrew Yang is starting to talk about, like, monthly, I don't remember exactly what it's called.
The
but
UBI, yeah. Is that a good idea? Is that the question?
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you thought it was sustainable, and if not, what should we be doing?
Yeah. So the problem with the UBI, in my opinion, is the U. So it stands for Universal Basic Income. He has in mind $1,000 a month for each American. That adds up to $3 trillion a year, which is the same size as the federal budget, or the federal tax take, roughly. So if you wanted to do it, you'd either have to raise $3 trillion a year, and that's ignoring the behavioral response where people might choose not to work because they have the UBI, or you'd have to cut everything the government does, or you'd have to do some combination thereof, right? I think a targeted approach is just smarter. And I think it's kind of okay to expect people to work and then give them a tax subsidy for doing that. I realize that there are going to be some people who can't work in recessions. That's why we have unemployment. There's some people who can't work because they're disabled. That's why we have disability insurance. There's some people who don't work because they're retired, which is why we have Social Security. But I guess my personal presumption is that people should be able to work, and if they can't for one of those reasons, we've got programs for that. But otherwise, we expect them to work. We provide a minimum wage, ideally, and an earned income tax credit, and that should be enough to get by on. I mean, I do think it's kind of a nice vision that he has, that some people will use the UBI to sort of found businesses or create new opportunities for them. But I think if you get paid a living wage, some people can save money and do it that way too, right? And I guess my concern is that there might be some people who play video games in their basement, and while that might be their highest utility thing to do, and as an economist I should respect that, it's not the future that I imagine for my children, right? And so I'd rather have them have the sort of, and this is kind of old-fashioned of me, but the sort of like the satisfaction that comes from working and from engaging with people in the workplace.
Any more questions?
I think he has one.
Hi. So a little while ago, you attributed some of the growth we saw during the Clinton administration to a little bit of the defense budget being freed up from the end of the Cold War, right? Do you think that in the current geopolitical climate of the world, that the amount of resources that we're spending on a defense budget is responsible, and is that a resource that we should be tapping into, maybe redistributing to other sectors?
Yeah, so I guess that's also outside my expertise. So now it just sort of feels like people are asking me what I would do. But it's a tough one. The United States has historically, over my lifetime at least, often played an outsized role in handling international disputes and problems, and in being the sort of the army and the militia of a bunch of other countries that didn't want to do it, right? And that's a pretty hefty responsibility that comes with a pretty hefty price tag. If we imagine what happens if, let's say the US just decided not to spend any of that money, and we spend it on more useful things, or what seemed at the moment more useful. I would also worry a little bit about that world, right? Because who fills the vacuum, the power vacuum, when the U.S. military isn't there? And do we trust that it's a benevolent group of countries, or country, And if not, are we making sort of all that we hold dear sort of vulnerable in that sense, right? So I think there's certainly room to spend less on defense, but I guess I wouldn't want to see us completely ceding, the international military might to the rest of the world by just completely driving that down to zero. That seems too much, right? So there's got to be a happy line somewhere, and I don't know exactly how you get to that medium spot. I'm a big believer in alliances and multilateral solutions, right? So I think if you kind of look at the recent U.S. foreign policy, it's been most successful in instances where it's been involved broad coalitions of other countries, and it's been least successful when it's been us kind of just flying off by the seat of our pants. And so I think I would like to see the U.S. be a leader, but a leader who worked constructively with lots of other countries, and that's contingent on having an executive branch that can do that.
Let's give Professor Clausing a
Thank you.